He stood alone on a remote island in the Caspian Sea, feverish, half mad, hunted like a stray dog. Just months earlier, he had ruled over one of the most magnificent empires in the Islamic world. Now, Sultan Muhammad II of Khwarazm, who once called himself the Second Alexander, was dying in exile, with no throne, no army, and no name that still carried fear. His empire, 10 million souls stretched across the Silk Road, had been turned to ash, not by a rival sultan or rebellion, but by a storm that rode in from the east, a storm with hooves, fire, and no mercy. It began with a mistake, not a battlefield loss, not a betrayal, but a decision made in a marble hall. Far from blood and dust, a decision to humiliate 3 messengers. 1 was beheaded. 2 had their faces shaved. It was an insult, nothing more. But to the man they represented, it was an act of war. That man's name was Genghis Khan. What followed was not just retaliation, it was a methodical erasure. The cities of Samarkand, Bukhara, Otrar, jewels of Islamic art and science, were reduced to rubble. Entire populations were butchered, libraries burned, rivers redirected so that even the land would forget what once stood there. And through it all, Genghis Khan never raised his voice. He let the destruction speak for him. This isn't a myth. This happened. And it started with a caravan of silk and gold, and ended with the extinction of a civilization. In the year 1218, a caravan set out from Mongolia, heading west. It was not an army. There were no banners or battle cries, only 450 merchants, interpreters, and handlers, moving slowly toward the Khwarezmian city of Otrar. Their cargo was a treasury of silk, gold, silver, and rare gems intended not for conquest, but for commerce. At their head was a message from Genghis Khan himself, proposing peaceful trade between 2 of the largest powers on earth. The Mongols had just secured their eastern front. Now, Genghis was turning his eyes toward the Silk Road, hoping to open it, not seize it. At least, not yet. The city of Otrar, perched on the northeastern border of the Khwarezmian Empire, was a critical gateway, rich, fortified, and proud. Its governor, Inalchuk, was a man of ambition and paranoia. He saw spies behind every veil, betrayal in every foreign accent. When the Mongol caravan arrived, he made a choice that would shape the century. He seized the goods, imprisoned the merchants, and accused them of espionage. Then, with the silent approval of Sultan Muhammad the Naltwangan, he had every member of the caravan executed. Every man, except one, a camel herder who escaped and galloped back east with a story that would shake the steppe. Word of the massacre reached Genghis Khan, not with anger, but with silence. Days passed before he summoned his court. When he finally spoke, it was not of vengeance, but of insult. In the Mongol worldview, messengers were sacred, trade was honor-bound, and the road itself, Silk Road or not, was a space of trust. The murder of merchants wasn't just a crime, it was a rupture in the order of the world. But Genghis still held out his hand. He sent a second delegation, 3 men, again, across the desert, bearing demands: surrender Inalchuk, return the stolen goods, offer an apology. What happened next set the world on fire. Sultan Muhammad ordered one of the envoys, a Muslim with ties to the empire, beheaded. The other 2, both Mongols, were sent back with their faces mutilated, their beards, a symbol of honor, shaved in humiliation. It was not just rejection, it was provocation carved into skin. In the eyes of the steppe, it was war. But this was not war, as Khwarezm understood it. They expected armies to march, alliances to shift, battles to drag on for years. What they faced instead was something else entirely, a force that did not march, but raced, that did not negotiate, but eliminated. Genghis Khan began to prepare not a punitive raid, but an annihilation. To the Khwarezmian court, it must have felt distant, abstract. Even, they had dealt with rivals before: Persians, Turks, Crusaders, but they had never met anything like what was now galloping toward them. The first sign came in the winter of 1219. Snow fell across the steppes. Then it melted into thunder. Over the next few months, Genghis Khan summoned an army unlike any the region had seen, somewhere between $100,000 and 150,000 horsemen, supported by engineers from China, siege experts from Central Asia, and a logistics system that moved faster than rumor. These were not tribesmen. They were a machine, mobile, ruthless, and impossibly efficient. Each warrior rode with 5 or 6 horses, switching mounts mid-charge, living off the land, sleeping in the saddle. They didn't wait for spring. They became it. And their first destination was Otrar. By the time the walls of the city came into view, the Mongols had already decided its fate. For 5 months, they circled the city, cut off supplies, and broke its will. No frontal assault, no mercy. They used prisoners as living shields, catapulted misinformation over the battlements, and shattered morale from within. Finally, when the gates cracked open, Inalchuk was dragged from the rubble not as a prisoner, but as a symbol. Genghis Khan did not execute him with a sword. He melted silver, poured it into his eyes and ears. A punishment for greed, a message without words. Otrar was erased. Its people, men, women, children, numbering over 100,000, were exterminated. The city was not looted, it was leveled. The Mongols left nothing for memory to cling to. And then they moved on. What started as a misunderstanding between 2 courts had now become something else, entirely a campaign of total destruction. The Sultan had gambled that distance, and pride would shield his empire. But he had wagered against a man who turned insults into iron, and rode not for territory, but for legacy. What lay ahead would make Otrar look merciful. The ashes of Otrar had barely cooled when Genghis Khan turned his attention to Bukhara. It was no frontier outpost, but one of the cultural jewels of the Islamic world, a city of scholars, theologians, traders, and poets. It was defended by thick walls, high towers, and the belief that geography would protect it. To its leaders, the idea that any army, let alone a horde from the east, could cross the Kizilkum Desert was impossible. That was the mistake. The Mongols didn't go around the desert. They went through it. With thousands of horses and camels, Genghis Khan led his army across one of the most unforgiving landscapes on earth, moving in silence, living on what little the dunes offered, drinking the blood of their horses when water ran dry. When the scouts of Bukhara spotted the first dust clouds on the horizon, it was already too late. The city had not just been found, it had been surrounded. The defenders of Bukhara were experienced, well-equipped, and certain of their position, but they hadn't faced Mongol warfare. Genghis lured the garrison into open combat beyond the walls, feigned a retreat, and then enveloped them. Within hours, the defenders were gone, buried beneath the very ground they thought they controlled. The gates of Bukhara opened, not in victory, but in surrender. And then the conqueror rode in. He entered not as a barbarian, but as a messenger. Standing in the main mosque of the city, Genghis Khan addressed the people not through translators, but directly, through words carried by his own commanders. He told the citizens that their sultan had failed them, that they had been abandoned to a war they never chose. It wasn't a speech, it was a sentence, and it began to be carried out immediately. The city was divided. Craftsmen were spared, but only to be sent east, far from their homes, into forced labor in the Mongol heartland. Youths were conscripted into the Mongol army, given new names, new languages, new loyalties. The rest, those too old, too weak, too defiant, were slaughtered. The great mosque where Genghis had spoken was repurposed into a stable. Books burned, libraries gone. Bukhara was not sacked. It was rewritten. But this was not chaos. It was deliberate. The Mongols left the aqueducts intact, just long enough to draw water for their horses. Then they destroyed them. The streets were cleared for their engineers to move freely. When they left, it wasn't in haste. It was in order, as if checking off a list. Bukhara was now part of history because the Mongols had decided it would no longer be part of the present. News of what had happened spread faster than the dust behind Mongol hooves. But even fear couldn't stop them. Samarkand was next, richer, stronger, and twice as confident. But confidence was no match for precision. By the time its citizens realized what Bukhara had suffered, the Khan's envoys were already at the gates, offering terms. Surrender, and you might survive. Resist, and you become Otrar. Or worse. The Khwarezmian army was waiting behind the walls, tens of thousands, bolstered by war elephants and siege weapons. Genghis Khan didn't scale the walls. He made them irrelevant. His spies had already mapped the city's defenses from within. Defectors whispered where the weak points were, and again, the Mongols baited the army out, then crushed it in the open. The gates of Samarkand swung wide, not in defiance, but in collapse. The punishment was the same, yet scaled. The soldiers who had fought were executed to the last. The civilians were divided, catalogued, redistributed. Engineers and scholars vanished into Mongol camps. Artisans were shackled and marched east. The rest were left to die in the ruins of what had once been one of the most dazzling cities of the Muslim world. Samarkand's fall was not just a military victory. It was a message to the entire region. No fortress is sacred. No army invincible. Through it all, Genghis Khan remained unseen by most of the conquered. His orders were carried out with mechanical clarity. His name passed from whisper to scream. But he wasn't chasing glory. He was dismantling an empire not for land, not for loot, but for memory. The Sultan, still alive, had vanished westward, and in his place, only silence remained. A silence that deepened with every city that fell. The fall of Samarkand marked the unraveling of whatever illusion still remained within the Khwarezmian court. Sultan Muhammad II, once heralded as a unifier and warrior king, was now little more than a fugitive. He abandoned the empire's central seat and fled westward with a shrinking entourage, hoping to find sanctuary beyond the reach of the Mongol horde. But Genghis Khan did not believe in boundaries. He dispatched two of his most feared generals, Subutai and Jeba, with a detachment of 20,000 to chase the Sultan to the ends of the earth if necessary. This was not conquest. It was a hunt. Cities that had once raised the Sultan's banner now greeted the Mongols with opened gates, not out of loyalty, but out of terror. Resistance was suicide. Surrender was survival, though never guaranteed. The pursuit was not swift, but it was relentless. Day after day, Muhammad's caravan grew thinner. Some deserted. Others were executed for slowing down. His robes, once silk and gold, grew threadbare. His titles became burdens. He changed his route constantly, trusting no one, speaking only in whispers. Across the Caspian, he hoped to vanish. But the Mongols didn't need to capture him. They only needed him to keep running. And behind that chase, Genghis Khan turned eastward again, not because his work was done, but because it had only just begun. Merv, Nishapur, and Urgench were next. If Bukhara and Samarkand had been dismantled, these cities were meant to be erased entirely. Merv was vast, ancient, a capital in its own right. Its leaders chose to surrender, expecting mercy. They opened their gates. They offered keys, gold, tribute, obedience. But this time, Genghis gave no speech. There was no negotiation. His soldiers entered, divided the citizens into groups of hundreds. And then the counting began. Each Mongol soldier was assigned a number of civilians, 300, sometimes 4. The killing was done methodically, face to face. No catapults, no fires, no distant screams, only steel, silence, and the rhythm of execution. Bodies piled high, streets ran dark, and when it ended, nothing remained. Merv ceased to exist, not metaphorically, but literally. Its canals were destroyed, its libraries turned to smoke, its survivors buried beneath its dust. At Nishapur, the story repeated with a new fury. One of Genghis Khan's sons-in-law had been ambushed and killed there, an offense not just personal, but dynastic. The response was annihilation. The entire population was exterminated. Even animals were slaughtered. The ground was soaked so deeply in blood that, for years afterward, nothing would grow. No birds landed. No travelers paused. The wind carried only memory. Urgench resisted longer. It was heavily fortified, stubborn, steeped in wealth. The Mongols besieged it for months, draining rivers, breaching dams, rerouting the Amu Darya itself to flood the city's defenses. When the walls finally fell, the retribution was slow and deliberate. Here, Genghis allowed his soldiers days of unrestrained plunder. The city was emptied brick by brick. What couldn't be taken was destroyed. What couldn't be destroyed was buried. When the river changed course permanently, it didn't just drown the ruins, it erased the map. By the end of 1221, the Khwarezmian Empire had vanished. Not collapsed, not fractured, vanished. Its capitals lay in ruin, its libraries lost, its rulers dead or in hiding. Millions had perished, not in battle, but in aftermath. This was not conquest for land or tribute. It was an execution carried out by an empire that viewed memory itself as a weapon. Genghis Khan did not merely defeat his enemy. He removed him from time. Yet even then, he was not done. He left behind governors, messengers, and scribes not to build, but to witness. The destruction had to be recorded. The lesson had to spread. And across the trade routes, from Persia to Baghdad, from the Caspian to the Indus, people whispered the name not in defiance, but in prayer. Not for his favor, but for absence. The fear was not that Genghis Khan would return. The fear was that he never left. In the final winter of 1220, the man who once ruled 10 million people died alone. Sultan Muhammad VI, whose word had once echoed from the Caspian to the Indus, perished not on a battlefield, not in a royal court, but on a remote island off the Caspian Sea, shivering in exile, stripped of his robes, his name, and his purpose. The cause disease, exhaustion, despair no one could say for certain. His body was buried in haste. No tomb, no procession, no legacy. And the empire he had sworn to defend no longer existed. He had fled its collapse, only to die in its silence. Subutai and Jebe, the Mongol general sent to pursue him, returned east not because their mission had failed, but because it had succeeded. The Sultan was no longer a threat. He was no longer anything at all. And that fact alone served Genghis Khan better than any public execution ever could. The death of Muhammad II completed the obliteration not only of Khwarazm's army, cities, and people, but of its idea. The war was not against a country, it was against an identity. But Genghis Khan did not stop with the Sultan's death. He did not retreat or pause. He pressed on, sending detachments further west into the Caucasus, into Khorasan, into the heartlands of Persia. The Mongol Empire was still coalescing into shape, but its message had already taken form. Submission brought survival. Resistance brought disappearance. Khwarazm's final remnants crumbled in shadows. Cities like Rey, Balkh, and Herat surrendered before a single arrow was loosed. Others resisted for days, some for weeks, but all met the same end division: depopulation, destruction. Some were left half-ruined, not out of mercy, but as warnings, smoldering monuments to what Genghis Khan could do, had done, and might do again. By the time his generals withdrew, what remained of the Khwarezmian world was not a conquered province, but a scar visible from every merchant route, etched into every survivor's eyes. The Silk Road, once lined with markets, mosques, and libraries, now bore the remnants of siege towers and mass graves. Trade resumed, but it moved under a different sky. One ruled not by scholars or sultans, but by a man whose empire had no walls and no borders, only riders. In every city that still stood, a single name echoed not in celebration, but in dread. Mothers whispered it to keep their children obedient. Scribes scratched it into parchment, sometimes in admiration, more often in warning. And every traveler, no matter how distant from the original warpath, understood what it meant. Genghis Khan had proven something no conqueror before him had dared to attempt. He had made erasure strategic. He had turned fear into policy. And long after the fires went cold, long after the swords were sheathed, that fear remained heavy, patient, eternal. When the smoke cleared, what remained of the Khwarezmian Empire was not a broken state. It was a memory trapped beneath layers of ash and silence. The cities were gone. The canals that once fed the fields had been torn apart, redirected or filled with corpses. The irrigation systems that had made agriculture possible for centuries crumbled, leaving once fertile plains to dry into dust. The population that had once sustained the empire had been reduced by as much as 90%. The survivors were few, scattered, broken, and often silent, either by fear or by the trauma etched too deeply into their minds to form words. The scholars, once the pride of Samarkand and Nishapur, had been either executed or carted off to the Mongol heartlands, stripped of their titles and heritage, valued only for their utility. Libraries, some of which had held manuscripts older than the Crusades, had vanished in fire. Books that carried generations of thought and law were burned to light the way for soldiers. Knowledge did not fall out of fashion. It was targeted, extinguished, unmade. The cultural loss was not accidental. It was methodical. Trade collapsed across the region. The Silk Road, once a living artery of exchange and wealth, choked on the ruins left behind. Markets disappeared. Currencies lost meaning. And merchants stopped traveling altogether, not because the roads were impassable, but because they were empty. Silence replaced commerce. The Mongols would eventually restore the flow of goods, but it would be under their terms, in their name, and under their banner. The cost of reopening the world had been the obliteration of the one that came before. Politically, the vacuum left by Khwarezm's fall opened the floodgates for new powers. The Ayyubids expanded cautiously. The Seljuks of Rum tested their boundaries, but none dared rise too quickly, too publicly. The shadow of the Mongol warpath still stretched over the horizon. Every regional ruler who dared claim independence now did so with one eye on the eastern steppe. Genghis Khan had made it clear his wasn't a temporary storm. It was a climate shift. Militarily, the campaign redefined the logic of warfare. Genghis Khan had demonstrated that logistics could be mobile, that speed could outrun defense, and that terror could win wars before the first arrow flew. There were no treaties, no diplomatic delays. Cities either submitted or vanished. In the aftermath, future generals across continents began to rethink how wars could be won, not with numbers or walls, but with unpredictability, precision, and fear used as a deliberate tool. But perhaps the most enduring effect was psychological. The destruction of Khwarezm had become a warning etched across time. For decades to come, stories of the Mongol advance spread faster than their horses. Parents invoked the name of Genghis Khan to hush crying children. Scribes recorded the scale of the slaughter in shaking hands. Even when the Mongols had moved on, the memory of what they had done remained embedded in the earth itself, unspoken, but understood. Genghis Khan had not only conquered an empire, he had turned its annihilation into a message, and that message would echo long after the cities stopped burning. By the time the last of Khwarezm's cities had been silenced, the land itself seemed changed. Roads that once bustled with caravans now lay untouched beneath drifting sands. Fields that had fed generations yielded nothing but weeds. The air was heavy not just with the stench of death, but with a new law, one not written in ink or stone, but in blood and fire. Genghis Khan had done more than destroy a kingdom. He had redrawn the limits of fear, rewriting what it meant to defy power in the age of empires. But the conquest did not end with destruction. It moved on, built on the ruin it left behind. Genghis did not hold territory in the traditional sense. He left behind no capitals, no crowned satraps, no temples of victory. What he left instead were routes, military, economic, psychological. Through the skeletal remains of Khwarezm, new trade networks would later emerge under Mongol control, brutally efficient, eerily secure, policed by the same men who had leveled cities to the ground. Those who survived the initial wave of conquest would later serve the very empire that had annihilated their world. Engineers from Bukhara, astronomers from Samarkand, linguists from Nishapur all relocated east, far from home, tasked with building for their captors. It was not assimilation. It was absorption. The Mongol strategy was not simply to win, it was to devour. The best minds of Khwarezm found themselves living beneath banners stitched with the image of the Khan, their work serving a new ideology, their legacy severed from the soil that birthed it. Even centuries later, the destruction of Khwarezm lingered not just in record, but in absence. Cities that never returned, dialects that vanished, lineages that ended. The damage was not temporary, it was genealogical. Entire family trees burned out in a matter of days. What once was a living civilization became, almost overnight, an archaeological question. Stones remained, but voices did not. Genghis Khan never apologized. He never justified the war as divine or righteous. There were no declarations of holy cause, no grand monuments to memorialize the fallen. His silence was part of the conquest. What he left was clarity. Challenge him, and nothing remains. Yield, and you may live though not as you were. What began with a single caravan and an insult ended with the disappearance of an empire. Not as a cautionary tale carved in hindsight, but as a deliberate act of political engineering. It was not madness. It was a campaign of intent, designed to be remembered not through praise, but through fear. And in that fear, Genghis Khan etched his name into history with a permanence no stone or scroll could match. Not because people would tell the story, but because they would never dare forget it. The Khwarezmian Empire vanished not in rebellion or gradual decline, but in a silence carved by fire. In just 3 years, an empire that once bridged Asia and Persia, that hosted scholars and commanded armies, ceased to exist. The cause was not nature, nor treachery from within. It was the weight of one man's fury, measured, relentless, and absolute. Genghis Khan had not simply punished an offense, he had executed a civilization. What began as a diplomatic insult ended in the eradication of an entire world, its cities erased, its memory bent to serve the fear that followed his name. No great chronicler stood to write the final chapter. The survivors were too few, too scattered. The rulers who might have retaliated had instead chosen silence. And the Mongols, after their storm passed, did not look back. They rode forward, and in their wake, they left not only ashes, but a void, a space where once there had been greatness, where now there was only the echo of what happens when power is mocked and vengeance is patient. The story of Khwarezm lives not in monuments, but in the absence of them. A ghost empire, buried beneath the weight of one decision, one gesture, one refusal to understand the man who had sent his messengers in peace. Whether Genghis Khan was justified, brutal, divine, or monstrous is for others to debate. But the lesson remains unshakable. Empires do not fall only to armies. They fall to pride. And when they do, history does not mourn them. It consumes them.